Hello, everybody. Greetings and welcome to Who Profits' second webinar. We are very delighted to have you all joining in our conversation today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Who Profits, we're a research center dedicated to exposing commercial activity with the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Syrian lands, mainly through operating a database of over 400 involved companies in the occupation through an information center and conducting in-depth research on the political economy of the occupation. The webinar today, titled Combating a Virus, Militarism and Securitization under COVID-19, comes as part of our recent work looking closely at how structures of political and economic structures of dispossession, of colonialism and accumulation shape the risks caused by the virus in Palestine. So thank you all for joining. Joining us today is Riya al-Sanah. Riya is a researcher with Who Profits, and Dr. Nisha Kapoor, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Warwick University. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, just a couple of technical remarks. If all the participants can please keep the audio muted and the cameras off, that would be great. After the talk, we're gonna have a Q&A. So for those of you who are interested in asking a question, please do so in the Q&A button at the bottom and not through the chat. And if you can indicate to whom the question is referred to, that would be great too. And for our speakers, if you can please speak close to the mic and with a clear voice so that we can all hear, that would be great. So without further ado, we're gonna start with our first speaker, Nisha. I'm passing the mic on to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks so much for the invitation. I think it's a really important conversation and I'm pleased to be part of it. I guess my work mostly focuses on the UK, the US, and recently India. So I'll mostly talk about the UK and India in relation to what's happening around surveillance and COVID, and there'll be some connections with Israel, obviously, because of the collaborations between states. So it seems to me that one of the starkest features of the state responses to COVID-19 has been the central role that's been granted to big tech to assist in delivering responses. While various track and trace systems are being put forward as necessary in the public interests of health and safety, I think it's really important for us to think about what other underlying agendas are at play here, and how this is a seemingly becoming an opportune moment to further extend surveillance practices and systems in different ways and in different contexts. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing how varying political economic interests, whether that be the nationalist citizenship agendas of the BJP in India, to some extent in the UK, or agendas of big tech corporations which rely on big data, are sort of coming together, coalescing in shared interests for mass surveillance. So for different reasons, there are different kind of actors who are, desiring and demanding big surveillance, and COVID-19 has acted as a gateway to extending practices that were already underway. So I'll say something just about the UK and then about India, and hopefully I won't run over the 20 minutes. So shortly, soon after Boris Johnson sort of declared a strategy of herd immunity in the UK, in March this year, Downing Street held a summit that became informally referred to as Digital Dunkirk, where a kind of war reference, one of the many, where about 30 different companies from across the UK online and science sectors were invited and asked to tell the British government what they could offer in its war against coronavirus. And amongst those in attendance at this meeting were like Google's London-based DeepMind Artificial Intelligence Research Unit, Palantir, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and a UK-based artificial intelligence startup Faculty, which has been awarded multiple government contracts, as well as various other companies too. It's worth actually noting that BAE Systems is on the government's group for dealing with ventilators. So Palantir, who is headed by the Trump supporter Peter Thiel, pledged to commit engineering staff to assist with the government effort. And Amazon has offered various things as well. Dominic Cummings put in touch these volunteers with the management of NHS X, the Health Services Digital Transformation Platform, or ARM. And in a kind of significant about turn against declarations that, you know, the NHS wasn't being privatized, the National Health Service in Britain wasn't being privatized, it, you know, has overnight opened up its data to big tech, and Palantir and Faculty have begun to sort of excavate NHS data. So Palantir has been eagerly trying to get an NHS, a contract with the health service in Britain for 2 years, and it's not been successful. And then kind of very quickly overnight, it has volunteered 45 engineers to work on a track and trace system in the UK for the sum of just £1. So now it has access to personal demographic service, the sort of NHS database, which is one of the most complete collections of personal information that we have in England and Wales. And so access to NHS data is really access to much bigger things. It's not just about access to the sort of private health system. So Palantir is collaborating with Faculty right now to data mine and consolidate government databases and to sift through huge amounts of personal information. Open Democracy revealed on last week that they were originally granted intellectual property rights to these data and were allowed to train their models and profit off this data to perfect other surveillance products that they might produce. And so I guess one of the things to kind of point to here is that, you know, we hear a lot about liberal critiques which emphasize abuses against individual privacies and data protection with this access to big data. But in some ways, this kind of misidentifies the violation or the problem, because, you know, while there's some issue around how big data sort of individualizes and targets individuals through surveillance capitalism, one of the, you know, the key issue here is that the gross uneven distribution of power and control and the opportunity for obscene levels of profit that's enabled through this mass data capture. So in this case, we might think about how much profit Palantir will make in future from a £1 contract with the NHS. What kind of prediction products will these tech companies be able to generate from data mining NHS data? And how will these products be used by big pharma, by health insurance companies, by capital more generally, and by government agencies and private companies who are tasked with assessing and distributing you know, social welfare benefits and unemployment benefits and so on, in order to decipher who's entitled to those benefits. And I think fundamentally, you know, these data are going to be critical for policing borders, for immigration policing. So it's worth recalling here that a key part of Britain's hostile environment policy has been which is a set of laws and administrative arrangements that were put into place a few years ago to make staying in the United Kingdom as difficult as possible for anyone with immigrant status, has involved data sharing between the Home Office and the government or public institutions such as schools and the NHS to create a kind of unified database or link between these different databases. And a freedom of information disclosure by Statewatch in 2016 showed that for the first 11 months of 2016, the Home Office had made over 8,000 information requests from NHS Digital. And 5,854 of these requests led to people being traced for deportation purposes. So the arrangement between the Home Office and the NHS has been temporarily suspended, but with Palantir and faculty coming in now, we can think about what the future possibilities might be around policing borders and around immigration control. And of course, it's not that difficult to stretch our imaginations that hard, because Palantir, Peter Thiel's Palantir quietly secured a £28 million contract from the Ministry of Defence in the UK, taking its deals with the UK government to at least £39 million. It's developed weaponized AI technologies, including digital profiling tools. The US Immigration and Customs Enforcement have been using for apprehending and deporting undocumented migrants in the US as part of Trump's hostile border policing. And of course, Palantir is heavily dependent on US military contracts. A contract with ICE in 2019 was worth like $42 million. And, as Palantir has been heralded by US governments for supporting national interest. But Palantir really made its name because of its work on security and defense, and it's been nurtured from its inception through networks and through financial backing from the CIA and various US defense agencies. It remains the intelligence services firm of choice, and it's notably known as the War on Terror secret weapon for the surveillance technologies that it's built for the US military, which have synthesized multiple strands of data, combined multiple different analytical tools, enabling US special operations forces to plan attacks in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Pakistan, and to surveil, capture, and kill people that it targets. So it's really performing an essential role for US military interventions, particularly through the war on terror. And I guess Palantir really brings to bear the close proximity between Silicon Valley and US military operations and the centrality of big tech to mass surveillance, which we're now seeing deployed in multiple different contexts. So, I guess a kind of link here is just that there's lots of borrowing interaction between the US and India on IT and surveillance technologies, and Indian tech capitalists have learned a lot from the US academies and from Silicon Valley. And just as there are close connections and circularities between the military and Silicon Valley in the US, so government is the biggest customer of burgeoning surveillance tech industry in India. So I'll just say something about what's happening there. So like Britain and numerous other governments, India quickly put together a central committee comprising government officials and tech leaders to deal with COVID as part of India's response to coronavirus. This committee is again spearheaded by Prime Minister Modi, and includes representatives from big tech and from key government agencies, such as India's has a unique identification authority, which is a biometric ID system that's been in germination for about 10 years there now. And so this committee includes a government rep from ADA, the name of this biometric ID system, but also from big Indian multinational companies who are involved in the tech game. And part of the role of this group is to develop India's track and trace app, which Modi, it's called Arogya Setu, and Modi asked all Indian citizens to download this onto their phones a few weeks into lockdown. This app was downloaded 50 million times in the first 2 weeks of it being launched, and has now been downloaded well over double that figure. It's compulsory for government and private sector employees to download this app. So, you know, there's an attempt to kind of insist that this is rolled out across the board. So the implementation of this track and trace app is very much under, you know, it's an Indian application. It's part of India's economic policy, which is to try and make in India, but work with companies elsewhere to, in the long term, develop Indian capabilities for its own sort of defense, military and surveillance industries. But, you know, essentially this app has multiple capabilities and multiple functionalities, one of which is to track the location of everybody who has it. And this location data, which is not necessary for track and trace purposes, is important for other kinds of bordering or policing regimes that it's trying to implement. And so in many ways, the justification for mass surveillance, the COVID crisis has come at a sort of opportune time for India, because it comes on the heels of mass protests that began there at the end of last year in response to the recently passed Citizenship Amendment Act, which is a key pillar of the BJP's Hindu nationalist agenda, essentially an anti-Muslim law granting Hindus and for now other religious minorities from neighboring states eligibility for citizenship in India, but the law explicitly excludes Muslims. And so the reason that this piece of legislation was hurriedly passed through Parliament, even though it was on the books for some time, was because in the northeast state of Assam, there has been this ongoing project since 2014 to update a National Register of Citizens, which is a statewide census that entails asking residents to prove their eligibility for citizenship, which the BJP have managed to co-opt really for its own interests, and its kind of exploited antagonisms between Assamese and Bengali speakers in Assam, which are entrenched in kind of long India colonial histories under the British. And so in practice, this exercise has required all residents of Assam to supply documents to prove that they have right to residency, or that they have paternal lineage in the state prior to 1971, before creation of Bangladesh. So what's happened is that there's a set number of documents that residents are being asked to provide, and once submitted, these documents are being digitized and processed through artificial intelligence software that's been developed by an Indian IT company called Wipro, who's the sort of key contractor for the project. And this software is determining the outcome. And there's lots of problems with this process. Loads of people have been left off the list for things like mismatched spellings and you know, inconsistency in records. And of course, there's huge gender discrimination and a real targeting of women, because the process relies on providing patrilineal links. So media reports suggest that the administrative cost of this NRC of this project has amounted to nearly 16 billion US dollars. When the final results were published in August last year, nearly 2 million people were effectively made stateless. However, a significant proportion of these people were Hindu, which was unexpected. And the nationality law that's just been passed through effectively acts as a safety net so that the Hindus who have been left off the citizenship register will be able to claim citizenship via the citizenship law. But Muslims, the hundreds of thousands of Muslims who have been left off the list, are being recategorized as illegal immigrants. And so along with the Citizenship Act, there's an eagerness to roll out the equivalent of the National Register of Citizens in India across the country in the form of something called a National Population Register. And Assam's particular history makes it in some ways a perfect, petri dish and an experimental state for the Hindu nationalist BJP government to cultivate and test political tools and strategies which they can roll out across India as a whole. So, these strategies are heavily dependent on surveillance, and the national and global tech corporations. This is a kind of really growing market for them and their array of biometric and artificial intelligence products. The security industrial complex in India is what's been termed a new sunrise sector. So alongside mammoth costs attached to building the detention camps, which are being built to house anyone who's been declared illegal or a foreign immigrant, there's money to be made in tracking disenfranchised populations. The facial biometrics market alone is expected to grow from 700 million US dollars in 2018 to 4 billion US dollars by 2024. India is a huge market because of the size of the population. So while the creation of these mass surveillance databases is already well underway across India as a whole, it's in Kashmir and Assam that we see like this unintended full wrath of mass surveillance playing out. So mass surveillance is key to counterinsurgency, which is obviously critical to the way in which India is governing Kashmir. But it's also really important for the way in which India is intervening now, or has been for some time, in its northeastern states and its border areas. So India currently has the world's largest domestic biometric identification system, which is the thing I mentioned before. Since 2010, the government has collected fingerprints and iris scans from more than 1 billion residents, each of whom has given a 12-digit ID number. And it was initially conceived of as a way to manage the distribution of social welfare. And it was a voluntary opt-in scheme, but it's becoming increasingly mandatory because you need it to fill tax returns or to apply, to get a mobile phone number or to buy a train ticket. All kinds of sort of mundane everyday activities require one of these ID numbers. And so this social registry database provides a perfect template on which it can build its other surveillance regimes that it's in the middle of doing. So Amit Shah, the BJP Home Minister, indicated recently, or some time now, I guess, ago, that the NRC would be rolled out across the country in the form of a national population register. And there have been legal changes which allow for biometric data to sort of be used to track individuals in real time. So some of the things that they're talking about rolling out across India as a whole are being tested in Assam. Individuals who don't make it onto the citizenship register are having their biometric data taken so that they can be tracked in real time. These biometric IDs in these database systems are being linked to criminal, the crime records databases, which are also, you know, in operation, being created by the same company, Wipro, who has developed, who was, you know, involved in the NRC stuff.
Nisha, sorry for cutting you.
Okay.
If you can please give concluding remarks.
I'm done.
Thank you.
So I guess just the last thing I wanted to say, and this is the conclusion, is that the development, you know, of the surveillance industry in India is happening alongside huge investments in defense, for which it works very closely with Israel. India is one of Israel's biggest customers, importers of Israeli arms, and it's a strong collaborator and involved in strategic partnerships. So between Indian and Israeli defense companies, and in terms of military training from the Israeli army, so that a number of the techniques and strategies that are being used against Palestinians or are tested out in Palestine are also being used and imported into Kashmir and into India's border regimes in the Northeast. And so I guess, yeah, it was just to sort of think about the specificity of what's happening in different places, but also the transfer and the borrowing and interaction of these surveillance and military regimes that happen across states. And I'll stop there. Sorry if I've gone over.
Thank you so much. Before we move to Riya, I'm just gonna remind our audience that if anybody has any question, please do so on the Q&A button at the bottom and not through the chat. And please indicate to whom the question is referred. So we're gonna move on to you, Riya.
Hi, hi everyone, and thank you, Hala, and thank you, Misha, for that introduction. Kind of smooth, very nicely smooths me in to the conversation. And yeah, I guess it's hard to kind of start a conversation on COVID-19 and the militarization of COVID without kind of reckoning with what COVID has exposed on a global scale. It has exposed that class-based violence that is also gendered and racialized has led to uneven led to uneven health outcomes and exposed how non-essential is the welfare of the working class on a global scale, and how non-essential the welfare of our essential workers also is. But as Misha was kind of talking, that it hasn't only just exposed things, and it hasn't kind of, it has also acted as a form of a shock doctrine or an opportunity for states to implement projects and processes which previously might have been a little bit difficult or a little bit tenuous. Kind of COVID-19 gives the opportunity to kind of roll a whole load of implement a whole load of technology, roll out a whole load of policies, kind of in the name of public safety and public health. But these also kind of also entrench and normalize population control. So if we think about all kind of monitoring people's movement and so on, it's become kind of a part of the conversation, whereas before it might have been a little bit tenuous, or kind of people might have been a little bit critical to it. Of course, our context here in Palestine and kind of the colonial context is probably a little bit different than the rest of the world. A lot of parts of the world, and we're now 6 months into this crisis, and you know, we kind of hear all the time exit strategy. The exit strategy is becoming clearer and clearer, that it places the economy at the center and less placing people's health at the center of it, or more correctly, it is placing the interest of a ruling minority above everybody's health and well-being. And we're starting to see a little bit the contours of the post-lockdown reality emerging. It's kind of hard to also be having a conversation on militarism and securitization without also mentioning that people are resisting at the moment. We are witnessing a moment of resistance, of revolt, of people kind of determined to take destiny to their own hands, rising up against economic devastation and uneven health impacts, but also rising against broader systematic injustices that predetermine them. We are sure to witness how these monitoring and tracking techniques and technologies are going to intertwine and progress into active and open repression. The notion of kind of crisis as an opportunity is not really a novel one, and holds true here in the same way that it holds true across the board. And certainly the Israeli Ministry of Defense, analysts of the Israeli Ministry of Defense have been quick to grasp this opportunity and jump on the bandwagon, and have framed the post-COVID-19 reality as one that offers fresh prospect for making profits for Israeli military and surveillance industries. Specifically, they have identified the potential to export of military and security industry specifically lying in countries' need to control rebellious population. A recent tender that was published by CBAT, which is the acronym for the International Defense Cooperation Directorate of the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and essentially it's a body that showcases Israeli military technology on an international scale, gives us a little sense of how Israel is looking at the current moment and where it's positioned itself vis-a-vis the current moment. And the tender talks a lot about the economic impact of COVID and what that means, and it calls for the mapping of the so-called security needs of, and I quote, all countries in the world except Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, because they are considered enemy states, and it's illegal to trade with enemy state. But you can trade with anybody and everybody other than these three kind of countries. The tender calls for the creation of a country-by-country portfolio, analyzing the security concerns and needs, and identifying potential areas for the export of Israeli equipment and technology. The Israeli, there's also a recognition that countries will now be spending less money on kind of like hard military kind of hardware, I guess, like tanks or fighter jets and so on, but will be spending much more money on the question of public security, which is in many ways another euphemism for domestic repression and population control. This is a trend that hasn't just started with COVID. It has been a trend over the last few years, but there's kind of an added opportunity that is developing here, and they're very clearly talking about this opportunity. So the tender calls for specifically outlining export potential in the field of biometric data collection technology, human and vehicle tracking system, face recognition, sound and visual detection systems, plates monitoring, cellular and cyber surveillance for intelligence gathering purposes, as well as information blocking and interception software. So it's like Israel has everything to offer that a repressive state might need in this current moment. And of course, it's not new for Israel to play an active role in repression on a global scale, as Nisha was mentioning, its relationship to India, its relationship to other governments, and so on. Historically and contemporary, Israel has time and time again allied itself on the side of power and against people, from its support of apartheid South Africa to Latin dictatorship to the current ties, again, with India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Trump of the United States. And these alliances are both ideological, but they also have they also stem from economic interest. Israel is one of the top 10 weapons exporters in the world, but it's becoming more and more kind of a central exporter of kind of cybersecurity and homeland security around the globe. So selling governments the tools to repress, to exert social control, social and political control. And at Who Profits, we've been trying to kind of understand how Israel is operating in this current moment. What does this mean internally here for the economy? What does it mean for the Palestinian people that are colonized by the Israeli state? And understand how all of these structures kind of work together and how Israel is exploiting the current moment. But it's difficult to understand the position that Israel holds in the global market of kind of military and security technology without understanding the centrality of militarism and repression to Israel's colonial project and the Israeli economy itself. Military violence has been instrumental to Israel's economic growth in the same way that it was instrumental for many settler colonial projects, many imperialist states, and so on. The 1948 Nakba and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and every instance of land confiscation and forcible displacement that has taken place since has been critical to Israel's process of capital accumulation by dispossession. This process works hand in hand with economic violence in the form of the development, dependency, pacification, that is always backed with the threat of physical violence. So these kind of, both these elements work in tandem and together. But one can speak of the rise or the rise of Israel's military industry as a central pillar of the economy following 1967 and the further colonization of Palestinian and Syrian land for many kind of geopolitical reasons, but also internal economic reasons. And since then, it has been really central to Israel's economy, but it's also been central to not just as an industry itself, but connected to other sectors. The continued repression of Palestinians and the implementation of Israel's colonial project has evolved into a lucrative business for Israel's military and surveillance industry. The military itself and the military rule functions as a laboratory, a business card, a client, but also an incubator for Israeli technological innovation. I've been given 10 minutes, so I'm going to cut to the chase because it's quite a lot to say. But we can kind of come back to this about how the Israeli military as a structure really forms the basis of Israel's high-tech industry, no matter what, even if it's kind of a company that is produced for the development of websites like Wix, that I'm sure many people have used. All of this technology is based on the military experience. The sector as a whole is really fed through Israel's military industrial complex and the relationship between the labor force in the high-tech sector and the Israeli military, and how the Israeli military operates as a training ground, but also shapes the industry itself. And we can kind of come back to that because I want to kind of cut to the chase a little bit. And I think it's important to think when Israel sells technology on a global scale, it's not just selling products. Israel is marketing an experience. It's an expertise and a self-conception that is rooted in the oppression of Palestinian people on both sides of the green line. And I had a nice quote that I wanted to say, but I'm not going to say that. So the oppression, the violence that is inflicted on Palestinians in refugee camps, or the securitization of Jerusalem and subjecting the Palestinian community there to invasive forms of surveillance, becomes kind of a showroom for Israel's surveillance technology and policing, where a lot of police force from around the world come and train. Gaza, beyond it being kind of a field where Israeli military companies perform their latest art in murder, but Gaza and the wall in the West Bank kind of also become a showroom for Israel's border control technology. The repressive permits of system and checkpoints again become a showcase for Israel's capability to implement biometric systems and biometric technology. But it's, as you know, it's as kind of Nithya was pointing to, technologies that are developed, perfected, and implemented locally do not stay locally. They travel around the world and they become part of much bigger processes. And this cross-fertilization between the relationship between the military and Israel's high-tech sector goes beyond the traditional things that we think about, cybersecurity, surveillance, and so on, but go into sectors that might seem quite incubus or subfields of the high-tech industry, like agri-tech, and Who Profits has done quite a bit of work on that. And I'll go into this a little bit now, the medical tech itself. The COVID-19 gives us a concrete example of the domination of Israel's military industry and the symbiosis between the state bodies and the private sector. So as soon as COVID-19 was declared a public health emergency, we saw the mobilizations of Israel's military, the military of defense, the army, state-owned and private military corporations, spearheading and managing the response to COVID-19. So we saw Israel's security agencies, the Mossad and the Shin Bet, being actively involved. So the Mossad is kind of deals with Israel's international security needs, and it operates a global network of covert agents that are routinely linked with confirmed or alleged extrajudicial assassination. It was the Mossad that was deployed in the area of medical procurement. So in an interview, a leader of the Mossad, the head of the Mossad's technology division, told Israeli journalists that some of the equipment was obtained illicitly, stating that, and here I quote, "We activate our special connections in order to get our hands on stock that someone else has ordered." So the Israeli interpretation of medical procurement during COVID was essentially international piracy. And the meaning of contact tracing was mass surveillance. And here, although in different contexts, countries were talking about either acquiring systems of mass surveillance and tracing and so on, or developing them, here there was no need to acquire, there was no need to develop, there was no need in any of that, because the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, already has such a system in place. It's called the Tool. The Tool was developed in the aftermath of 9/11 as a counterterrorism measure. It contains people's names, addresses, phone numbers, it records phones, data that's transmitted through the phones, and so on. This tool is now, we also know that NSO group, that I'm sure people know about its various kind of complicities around the world and violations around the world, is now involved in a process of privatizing the tool and selling it on the global market. Soldiers were deployed on the streets to control the movement, to control people's movement during lockdowns. the military research directorate was put in charge of the technological response to the virus, not the Innovation Authority, not the Ministry of Science and Technology, not any academic bodies, but a military body that actually develops weaponry for the Israeli military. This body developed a technological, set up a technological center that provided the institutional framework for collaboration between military and the medical sector. Although the media framed the collaboration as a heroic show of solidarity, officials involved were clearer about what this partnership means in terms of the opportunity that it provides in generating profits, but also an opportunity to diversify their product offering. So the director of the government's company's authority was very clear about this in an interview. Again, they're very clear about kind of how they use their relationship to the military and what this means, because it's useful, right? It's useful in a global market for an Israeli company to say we had a contract with Israel or the Israeli military, or that this technology is developed based on knowledge that is used by the Israeli military. Because if it is used by the Israeli military, or it's knowledge that is technology that is developed on knowledge based on military experience, you know that it's been tested in real life, it's tested on human beings, and so therefore it becomes of an added value on the market. So they're very open and blasé about this relationship. And I quote what he said here. And he said, there are two kinds of industries where there's big money. The industries developing means to kill people, and the industries developing means of saving them. Lucky for us all. And Israel's big kind of military companies, Elbit, Rafael, Israeli aerospace industries, were all very centrally involved, and now they're involved in kind of making medical equipment. You make bombs and you kill, but you also make ventilators and you save lives. So I'll just mention a couple of those things. There was a joint initiative by Elbit and Elka System, which is a fully owned subsidiary of Israeli aerospace industries, to develop a remote patient monitoring system for coronavirus patient. AnyVision, sure people have heard also about AnyVision, and the Israeli aerospace industries will begin to deploy thermal cameras at hospitals in Tel Aviv. These cameras will be able to remotely measure body temperature and determine whether high temperature is a result of the disease or physical exercise. This technology was originally developed for military warships and drones. And we know that these companies, or Israeli military companies in general, they acquire most of their profit from security and defense contracts, but they're also generating huge amounts of profit from kind of non-military, non-lethal technology or products. Another company that is developing COVID-19 related products is the Israeli startup Sensible Medical, which kind of is composed largely of veterans of Unit 81, a top secret technological unit of the Israeli military. The company is piloting the use of its REDS system to monitor the lungs of coronavirus patients in a number of Israeli hospitals. The CEO of the company told reporters that the system is based on military technology, and quote, intended to see through walls for urban warfare. So even if the kind of the technology or the product seemingly non-harmful or actually positive for saving life or so on, it is hard to disconnect these, or one shouldn't disconnect these. It's not that it's hardness from the broader system and the broader structure that brings about the establishment and the creation of these structures. So if the Israeli, and I'll finish on this, so if the Israeli Ministry of Defense's tender is anything to go by, it looks like there will be a coordinated global attempts to further entrench repression and coordinate this process of repression, because the impact of COVID has been a global one. It's not like one country is affected and another country isn't affected. And we already see that companies are kind of rising up to the challenge of the moment and developing their technology further and further. And so now you have a lot of companies that are previously involved in just kind of facial recognition technology. Now it's all about how do you recognize faces that when they have masks, when they have the goggles on, when they have any form of kind of facial covering. So you have one American company called Rank One Computing that is already its technologies applied across the US in various different police departments. There's an Israeli company, CareSight AI, that has raised $5 million recently to also develop facial recognition technology that can transcend you covering your face. And I guess at this moment, I guess it's something for all of us to constantly think about. But I guess this particular moment pushes us to think a bit more about how do we, of course, there's similarities that can be drawn between different places and different lived experiences, and it's used, but we need to think about how do we move beyond analogies of similarities and kind of performative analogies of tear gas here, tear gas there, uniform here, uniform there, it's all the same. To dig in a little bit deeper, to kind of trying to identify material connections, shared logics, and a better understanding of the way in which this technology, capital, and narratives move beyond repressive, move around in repressive regime, how they bolster each other in each stop that they make, because I think it will give us a better understanding of the moment, but also better equipped us in understanding of what we do as this moment evolves. And that's me, and I know I went over time, and I'm sorry.
Thank you both so much for the really interesting information. We're gonna move now to the Q&A. So I'm gonna start with this question to Riya. Could you talk more about surveying the context of Palestinian labor?
Sure. So, I mean, the Israeli state implements surveillance in all spheres. After all, its relationship to the Palestinian people, wherever they are, across the Green Line, and even in refugee camps and in the diaspora and so on, is one of a colonial state, and we're colonial subjects that need to be controlled, surveyed, and monitored, and so on. So it's kind of cross sphere. In particular, when we talk about labor, Palestinian labor, there's around 113,000 Palestinian workers from the West Bank and East Jerusalem that enter, that kind of cross into the Green Line for works or in the illegal settlements. In order for you to access this workplace that is often the only options that people have because of scarcity of jobs in the occupied West Bank and in the Palestinian economy in general. In order for you to be able to access these jobs, you must have a permit that is issued by Israeli military bodies. Normally, and this, in order for you to apply for this permit, you also need to have a biometric data. Since 2005, Palestinians, for any asking for permits for any reason, even if for medical reasons, have to have a biometric ID. So it's a very kind of surveyed and militarized process anyway, and you have to cross through the checkpoints to get the job, etc., etc. But during COVID, Israel forced Palestinian workers were essentially forced to download an app that is called al-Munassiq. It translates into the coordinator. The offices of the Israeli civil administration in the West Bank, where people would apply for these permits, were closed because of COVID-19. And so people were forced to download this application on their phone. And to complete the process of downloading the application, which enables you to apply for a permit, it enables you to check the status of your permit, it enables you to check if you have a security, if you can't travel for any security reasons and so on. And in order for you to complete the process of the installation of this application, you have to willingly approve for the Israeli state to latch onto your phone, have access to your camera, any form of data, your movement, and so on. So it was kind of, the application was launched in February 2019, but with COVID, it was like, all right, now you all have to use this because it's the only option that people had, and many people have downloaded it on their phones because there's no other alternative.
Thank you, Riya. Here's another question for you. Dear Riya, thanks a lot. Could you please give us 2 or 3 examples? Which products is Israel selling right now to whom? How many countries is Israel dealing with in terms of weapons and surveillance system? Greetings from Germany, Joan.
Hi. Okay, so I mean, we know that to know exactly and precisely each and every country that Israel is selling weapons to is quite difficult, because not all the deals and not all the relationships with governments are public. We know that Israel deals with the mass majority of the European Union countries. They deal with the United States, obviously. They deal with countries in Asia, and so on. So we know that it operates a global network of selling its technologies. In the sense of current COVID-19 developed technology that is also being sold, as I mentioned, the case of Sensible Medical. It's an Israeli company. It's an Israeli company that is now involved in selling medical equipment that are developed during COVID. Again, as I mentioned, based on military technology. It's being sold. We know that it's being sold in Italy and the United States. But yeah, so I mean, there's kind of a myriad. We know that Elbit one of the biggest drone manufacturers in the world, has relationships with the UK, with France, with Sweden, with Switzerland, with Italy, with kind of all over the spectrum. And really pick any Israeli military company, and you'll find that it has more than an extensive list of customers. But you can also go to our website. We have a database, as Hala mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, of over 500 Israeli and international companies that are operating here. And there you can research you can research by company, by region, by country, by topic, by so on, and it can give you a sense of these kind of global Israel's relationship to the global market.
Thank you, Riya. So another question for you, Riya. Could Riya reflect on the decision by Microsoft to divest from AnyVision based on holders' external audit?
Hi again. I think I mean, obviously, Anyvision was exposed for the company it is, a company that violates rights with no regards for any international treaties or laws and so on. And there was considerable pressure on Anyvision to divest. Sorry, on Microsoft to end its relationship with Anyvision. I don't work at Microsoft. I can't give a definite answer to where that has come from. But I think that companies are worried about reputational damage. They're worried when they're exposed as ones that have relationships with such companies, especially if they're trying to sell themselves as kind of do-gooders in other parts and in other sections, and so on. So I think there's definitely all of that working together, but also Microsoft said that it's out of economic, it's more out of its internal economic decisions and where it's choosing to focus its work. We know that Microsoft is by no means leaving the Israeli market. It's the opposite. It's expanding. It's constantly expanding its operation in Israel's high-tech sector. It's constantly buying Israeli startup companies and setting up artificial intelligence research and development units here as well. So it's not that Microsoft is suddenly kind of has seen the light and cut the relationship with Anyvision on the basis on that basis, because it has a myriad of other operations.
Thank you, Riya. I have a question for both you and Nisha. Hi, Nisha and Riya. Could both of you please comment on possibilities and challenges for resistance/organizing to the state/corporate practices of surveillance you've discussed in the COVID era? Thanks, Aziz.
Can you repeat again? Sorry.
Sure. Could both of you please comment on possibilities and challenges for resistance and organizing to the state and/or corporate practices of surveillance you've discussed in the COVID era? Is it okay if we start with you, Nisha?
Yep. Hi, Aziz. I guess, I mean, it's a difficult question because, it's like, yeah, when something is, when surveillance regimes are so all present and geared not just at trying to find out as much information as possible about everybody, the entire population, but also about trying to control or monitor, trying to influence behavior and opinion in so many different ways. It becomes sort of all intrusive. But if we think about just prior COVID, there were mass protests happening across India in response to the Citizenship Amendment Act, and in response to and in Assam in response to the various implications of the NRC, and in some ways the sort of fear of health risks that have come with COVID, and well, actually just the kind of imposition from the state in the case of India of lockdown have enabled the governments to kind of impose to restrict movement and mobility, except, as Riya was saying, for labor, for purposes which suit the state's interests. So I think one of the things to maybe think about is, and this is open for debate, it's not a hard and fast answer, but it is to think about, one, that how we continue or return to the kinds of protests that were happening just prior to COVID, which includes resisting the sorts of surveillance apparatus that was there, and how surveillance mechanisms can be subverted for the purposes of resistance. But I guess also to think about, and part of the sort of response needs to address, is all the things that the governments have been quietly able to do while we've been locked down. So, you know, that's a whole bunch of stuff, including arresting many of the protesters who were involved in, you know, who were leading or, you know, really involved in protests prior to COVID. But yeah, so I mean, I guess there are, you know, there are ways in which these technologies can be. I mean, I think one of the nice things, or one of the hopeful things, certainly about India, is that so huge amounts of the populations still are kind of able to escape the surveillance systems. They don't have, you know, there is still large chunks of the population that don't have mobile phones, that aren't digitized in the kind of ways that surveillance technology requires. And so, I don't know, I think maybe it's about thinking about how we subvert the technology that's there, how we bring into public ownership some technologies that are seen to be needed. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisha. Riya, do you have anything that you want to add as an answer to this question? Because it was addressed to both of you, so.
I mean, it's a really tough questions. It's really hard to think about, you know, in a context that is so surveyed, and where these kind of these technologies are deployed in many ways, and they kind of feel all evasive. But I guess there is still a point in challenging that. And, you know, I kind of, you know, one of the big things at the moment that I'm just like thinking about a lot, and I'm guessing, you know, a lot of you are also thinking about, is what's happening in the US at the moment, and kind of how a central demand has been about defunding the police. So it's kind of, yeah, it's challenging the structures themselves that are using the technology, rather than just the technology itself, because that in and of itself is not necessarily the issue. The issue is who's using it, by whom, like how is it used, how is it developed, and so on. And so I guess it's maybe one of the ways of thinking about it is thinking about the structures that use these technologies, and then kind of what can we do about that. You know, Nisha talked about public ownership and so on, or is it kind of weakening the very same structures themselves that are using these technologies in such a repressive way, on a global scale. But I think it's a very kind of interesting conversation to have, and I personally don't have ready-made answers for that for that question.
Thank you. This is a question to Nisha. Could you speak to India's role not only as an importer of oppression, but also as an exporter?
Right, there's just a problem with my mic. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's also kind of important to note that India's defense industry, its export sales are rising significantly. I guess its key markets are like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, I think Mauritius. But I think critically, you know, in India's case is certainly to think about the kind of role that its sort of burgeoning defense industry is playing in all the military and militarized sort of expulsion and genocide that's happening in those areas, in Myanmar, of course, at the moment. But you know, is critically to think about the role that all of this, the role of, or the consequences of this for Kashmir. one of the things that's happened under lockdown, as I was just kind of indicating, you know, it's been an opportunity for governments to do things on the quiet. You know, has been that it's passed laws to ease the ability of other Indians to settle in Kashmir. You know, slowly it's undoing. So Kashmir had kind of special status up until August last year, because of its kind of the legacy of the India and India's independence was that the you know, Kashmir's sovereignty was yet to be decided, and they've never had the opportunity for sort of to decide its own fate. And one of the things that was significant about last year was the Indian government's abrogation of the article that gave Kashmir special status. And one of the things they've done under lockdown is ease the possibilities for people for individuals and I guess companies to settle and occupy that land, so that it's beginning to look like a kind of settler colonialism that is all too familiar in Palestine. So yeah, I mean, it certainly does play a role, certainly around South Asia, for an Asia for exporting arms. But you know, all of this has critical consequences for Kashmir as well.
Thank you so much. It seems that we have reached the end of our webinar. Thank you both so much for the fascinating conversation. Thank you for all those who attended the webinar and who watched us live on Facebook. Looking forward to our future meetings, and I invite you all to visit our website, www.whoprofits.org, and follow our Facebook page, Who Profits Research Center. Thank you all again. Looking forward to seeing you again. Have a good night. Bye-bye.